Welcome back to today's Daily English Look. Okay, let's unpack this. If you were like most people, you probably grew up with some pretty simple foundational advice. Be talented, be diligent, work hard, and you will succeed. And that idea, the whole meritocratic ideal, it really served as the engine for prosperity in the rich world. For, most of the 20th century, people built comfortable lives, and it didn't really matter whether they inherited a penny. But the stack of sources we've analyzed today, they paint a pretty terrifying picture. They suggest that that whole engine is seizing up. The importance of hereditary wealth is rising so rapidly across advanced economies that it's now a profound structural problem. It's imperiling the very ideal of meritocracy, and maybe even the stability of capitalism itself. So our mission in this deep dive is to understand the scale of this inheritance boom and really analyze what it means for your economic future. And we're going to jump right into the shocking numbers. If you look across the world's advanced economies, people stand to inherit roughly $6 trillion this year.
$6 trillion? That's a staggering figure. It represents about 10% of total GDP.
And that 10% figure, that's what's causing the real systemic alarm, right?
Exactly, because you have to remember where we came from. Annual flows of inheritance during the middle of the 20th century, they were typically hovering around, 5% of output?
So we've doubled it.
We have essentially doubled the importance of passive wealth transfer in just a couple of generations. And this is not just some, statistical anomaly. It is a clear, long-term global trend. Our sources show inheritance flows have doubled in France since the 1960s, and they've nearly trebled in Germany since the 1970s.
So what does this actually mean for you, for the listener, especially if you're younger or maybe just starting out?
It means the deck is stacked differently. A young person's ability to achieve those basic milestones of life, buying a home, starting a family, achieving long-term financial security, it's now determined by inherited wealth nearly as much as it is by their own success at work.
So inheriting is becoming nearly as important as working.
In short, yes. That's the takeaway.
That immediately begs the question, what is driving this tectonic shift? We know people are living longer, but, that alone doesn't explain this explosion in wealth transfer. Our sources suggest it's a kind of toxic cocktail of factors. First, yes, we are a wealthier aging society, which means more accumulated capital per worker just exists in the system. But the real structural fuel, it comes from two related things. A slackened pace of overall economic growth, which the sources bluntly call sclerosis. And secondly, booming, often speculative, housing markets.
And when you put those together, it causes the scale of wealth relative to incomes to just absolutely balloon. We are seeing unprecedented wealth to GDP ratios, and this is particularly evident across Europe where, productivity growth has been dismal for decades.
Right. And to understand why that slow growth is so disastrous, we have to touch on a core economic concept, right? The whole R is greater than G thing.
Exactly. R being the return on capital, so how fast wealth grows passively. And G is economic growth, which is really how fast your labor income grows.
So if your job income, your G, is only growing by 1 or 2% a year, but the value of the assets you already own, R, is going by 4 or 5%. What happens?
Well, the relative importance of what you own versus what you earn just increases dramatically. And when you have this massive accumulation of wealth, the stock in the economy, and that stock is highly concentrated, it just means there is more to pass on to the next generation.
Which results in the birth of this new inheritocracy.
Precisely. Wealth concentration reinforces itself.
This gives us a moment to reflect on history, because for a lot of the 20th century, vast estates didn't actually last.
No, they didn't.
They were often broken up, maybe due to bad investing by the heirs, but more often by these huge external forces like war, hyperinflation, high taxes, things that just wiped out paper fortunes. I found the calculation about American old money just incredibly striking.
It is, isn't it?
If America's rich families from 1900 had just invested passively, spent just 2% of their wealth annually, and had the usual number of children, then mathematically we should have something like 16,000 old money billionaires today.
And yet, in reality, we have fewer than 1,000 billionaires from those families. And most billionaires today are actually self-made.
Wow.
That number, it tells us that for over 100 years, the financial system operated a kind of churn mechanism, a sort of creative destruction that actively broke up these vast inherited empires. It reset the board every generation or two.
But that mechanism is clearly failing now. So why? Why is this historical trend of fortunes breaking up being so definitively overturned in the 21st century?
What's fascinating here is that it's a two-pronged attack. billionaires today are better at amassing riches, and crucially, they are far, far better at preserving them. Parking wealth is no longer some complicated thing. You can drop billions into a passively managed index fund, hire the best wealth managers, and just watch it grow.
It's all automated.
Exactly. The principles of sophisticated wealth management are now commonplace and digitized. And on top of that, governments have consistently weakened the structural safeguards. I mean, policymakers across the rich world, they've cut inheritance taxes, introduced countless loopholes, or just dismantled them altogether.
Making it structurally easier to pass fortunes on intact.
Yes.
And that structural preservation is just accelerating the transition into a truly entrenched inheritocracy. We saw data from the UBS Bank in 2023, which shows just how quickly inheritance is becoming a primary path to extreme wealth. 53 people became billionaires that year purely from inheritance.
53. And that figure is not far short of the 84 people who made their own fortunes.
Think about that ratio. We're getting to the point where inheriting a fortune is almost as common a route to extreme wealth as building one from scratch.
And that leads us very neatly to the most surprising finding in the stack, which is that this isn't just about the super rich. The most striking revelation is the central role of housing wealth for the upper middle class.
Exactly. Property values have just soared for decades, especially in those prime global cities, the apex cities like London, New York, Paris.
Right.
And those people who were fortunate enough to buy property before that long boom began, well, they're now passing on these truly massive, often unearned windfalls to their kids.
And the consequences of this are, well, palpable and sometimes absurd. You have these high-earning professionals, bankers, corporate lawyers, people you assume are financially independent.
Sure.
And they are now fighting bidding wars over houses from the estates of, say, deceased taxi drivers, because those homes are the last affordable entry point into a desirable neighborhood.
That's incredible.
The crucial takeaway here for the audience is that as housing becomes unaffordable, the link between a high income and a comfortable life is just severed. A 90th percentile income, which is a very high salary, is now often too small to pay for a 90th percentile life in these major economic centers.
So you can't earn your way into the comfortable lifestyle your parents had.
You can't. You have to have capital.
And that capital is overwhelmingly sourced, not from personal savings or your career, but from what we call the bank of mom and dad. This is fundamentally changing who can access opportunity. Let's just look at the data scale in the UK to illustrate this point. For people born in the 1960s, about 1 in 6 was projected to receive an inheritance of more than 10 years of average annual earnings.
Which is already significant.
It is. But for those born just 2 decades later in the 1980s, that ratio rises dramatically to 1 in 3.
1 in 3. And the inequality within those inheritances is just as startling, maybe even more socially corrosive. Think about the split among 35 to 45-year-olds today. A fifth of them are expected to inherit less than £10,000.
Barely enough to cover a few months' rent.
Exactly. Meanwhile, a quarter of them are expected to inherit more than £280,000.
Wow.
So think about that difference. For young people today, the starting line for financial independence is separated by £250,000, purely based on the luck of who your parents are and whether they bought a house 30 years ago.
And this rise of the inheritocracy should be deeply disturbing for advocates of, free markets and open competition. It creates a clear rentier class that faces a series of, bad incentives.
Perverse incentives, really.
Yeah. When you're a rentier, someone whose income comes from existing assets rather than new labor or innovation, your incentive structure changes completely. You spend your time and energy gaming the tax system to protect your wealth, rather than directing that capital to productive, innovative uses that benefit the wider economy.
We also see the consequence in political behavior. To protect their single largest asset, their home, homeowners become fierce enemy-wise. Not in my backyard activists.
Right.
They organize to block new housing development, which, inadvertently or deliberately drives up prices for everyone else. They are actively undermining opportunity for the next generation.
And crucially, they have this massive financial safety net coming. The new rentiers may face very little incentive to work, to take risks, or to innovate.
Which is the exact opposite of what a dynamic, competitive meritocracy demands.
And even more worrying is the growing political and social fallout among those who don't benefit from this boom.
The underclass of non-beneficiaries.
Right. When young aspirational workers believe that the system is structurally stacked against them, that their diligence just won't pay off, that the comfortable life their parents had is now unattainable, well, The incentive to strive is fundamentally blunted.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this widespread disaffection has huge political consequences. When young people believe that economic contract is broken, their support for mainstream political parties just withers, and that leads to polarization and instability.
So it highlights the urgency of fixing the underlying structural problem.
It really does.
The sources are clear that addressing this is, well, it's difficult. The most obvious tool is inheritance tax, which is arguably the fairest way to deal with the inheritocracy. You take a portion of passive wealth transfer to fund opportunities for the working generation.
Makes sense on paper.
But inheritance taxes are profoundly and consistently unpopular.
It's a really interesting psychological barrier. Governments, instead of enforcing them, have consistently weakened them. Why are these taxes so politically toxic?
It hits two critical pressure points. First, it's viewed as double taxation. You're hitting assets that were already taxed when they were earned. And second, and maybe more powerfully, it attacks the universal desire of parents to provide the best possible start for their children. It feels like the state interfering with a family legacy.
But policymakers just avoid it.
They do. They focus on more politically palatable solutions, even if they're less effective.
That makes sense. And as the sources point out, it would be mad to wish for the catastrophic events of the 20th century, war and inflation, to destroy fortunes and reset the system.
Of course.
So we need positive structural fixes that work within a democracy.
Absolutely. The sources identify three key actions that policymakers really must undertake to restore that link between work and wealth. And the first is tackling housing supply.
Building enough houses in the right high-demand places is the single biggest policy action governments can take.
Why that one first?
Because the bulk of this inheritance boom comes from property inflation. So if you stabilize property prices by increasing supply, you immediately take the wind out of that massive unearned windfall. It's the fastest way to make G, income from labor, start catching up with R, return on capital.
Okay, so supply is key. What's the second lever?
Second is property taxes. Specifically levying sufficient annual property taxes, and especially those that target underlying land values. This is different from a regular property tax.
Explain that mechanism for us. How does taxing the land, not the house on it, bring down prices?
So when you tax the value of the land annually, the tax liability is what we call capitalized into the purchase price.
Okay.
Essentially, the future annual tax burden makes the asset less appealing to a buyer today. A buyer knows they have a higher annual payment, so they're only willing to pay less for the property up front.
So it directly and structurally brings down those dangerous house price to income ratios without needing a crash.
Exactly. It shifts the burden from the initial worker saver to the inheritor owner.
That's a powerful distinction. And the final remedy.
Anything that boosts overall economic growth and productivity. We're talking about major structural reform, especially needed in countries, particularly in Europe, that are suffering from that sclerosis we mentioned. If we can get G, growth, back up significantly, that naturally brings down wealth to GDP ratios over time. It shifts the focus and the reward system back to income earned through labor and innovation.
The stakes are incredibly clear, and our sources really hammer this home. The period we call the heyday of meritocracy delivered social mobility, rapid growth, and widespread prosperity. The rapid rise of inheritance fundamentally challenges all this progress.
It's creating a two-tiered economy, one for those who own and one for those who earn.
So what does this all mean? The good news, according to the source material, is that with targeted hard work by policymakers, those days of broad meritocracy can return. But the challenge lies in political will, not in economic understanding. The challenge for you, the listener, is to consider which of these structural remedies, massive housing supply, targeted land value taxes, or an aggressive pursuit of economic growth, you believe offers the fastest and most politically feasible path to reestablishing the value of working hard over simply inheriting. And this raises a really important question. In a world where inheritance sets the starting line for financial security, how long can we truly measure diligence and talent when the difference in access to basic necessities is separated by $250,000? All right, that's all for today's episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to like, save, and follow. Your support is the motivation that drives my progress.